Hi, good afternoon. My name is Abigail Levine, and I work within governmental relations at Minera Foundation. And I am here today with Gabriella Rossman, who is the legislative director from the Juvenile Children's and Advocacy Project. Gabriella's background is in behavioral psychology, and she's been working with children and adults with special needs. She returned to school in 2016 and received her JD in 2020. She is currently a practicing attorney with the Juvenile and Children's Advocacy Project and the adjunct professor for street law at UHLC. Gabriella also does pro bono work with the Center for Urban Transformation in Houston's Fifth Ward. And just some quick more information about GCAP. Since 2014, the Juvenile and Children's Advocacy Project of Texas at the University of Houston Law Center has been a leading advocate for juvenile justice in the Houston area through several unique programs. GCAP seeks to reduce juvenile delinquency and improve life outcomes for economically and socially disadvantaged youth, the provision of legal, educational, and social support services, as well as legislative advocacy. Gabriella, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting us here today. I'm really excited about this.
So just to start off, I was wondering if you can tell us more about GCAP, or the Juvenile Children's and Advocacy Project.
So absolutely. So as you mentioned, GCAP was started in 2014. It was started by David Dow and Katja Dow. And the mission is really to reduce juvenile delinquency, but by primarily targeting the underlying causes. So the idea is that we're not treating the symptoms of the problem, but we're actually going in and finding the cause of the issues that might lead to what people might consider delinquency, and sort of targeting the roots, which include like legal support, educational support, legislative advocacy, and then of course, the primary focus, I think, for many of our communities is the systematic racism that's involved in all of the justice system.
Absolutely. That is so true. So often there is just so many underlying issues, and it's such a complex problem that it can be difficult to tell which way to approach the situation.
Yeah.
So kind of more on that, I was wondering if you can speak to more about what led to GCAP's founding.
So GCAP really identified some primary issues in Harris County that needed addressing, and that led to where our practice areas are focused. So we have three primary practice areas, and again, these were identified based on needs. So one of them is that the term that we use in Texas, because I know that the language can be different in different states, is youth with dual system involvement. So that means that youth who might be part of a CPS system, like a child protective system, and then youth who have also had some sort of contact with the justice system. So as GCAP identified, those are sort of the most vulnerable youth because they're sitting in both systems. So we created a direct youth representation program where both GCAP attorneys and law students through the University of Houston Law Center represent these dually involved youth in dually involved systems, both in their delinquency cases and then also in their criminal cases, maybe in child welfare cases, and then as guardian ad litem. So guardian ad litem is sort of a unique position for adults in the court where an attorney is there to serve the interest of the child. So basically, if you're telling me like I'm your attorney and the kid says I want ice cream, then my job as an attorney is to like go out and advocate for ice cream. I'm obviously simplifying this. A guardian ad litem is there really to focus on the youth's best interests. And that might mean advocating for educational needs, therapeutic needs, and then also making sure that their attorneys in their delinquency cases are zealously advocating on their behalf as well. We also have a record sealing program, and that's sort of like, I would say, a strong bulk of GCAP's work. So unless a youth record is formally sealed, and I'm going to try to use the word youth instead of juvenile because I think there's sort of a pejorative term with juvenile, unfortunately. So it can be accessed by like any person in any agency. Comes to the surprise of most people because they don't realize that actually these youth records, while we consider them to be confidential, they actually can be. And that can really create a barrier for kids along the way and as they become adults. Like if you use a Common App for college and it asks, have you ever been adjudicated of anything? Then you would have to answer yes unless your record was sealed. Employment, licensing, Section 8 housing, all of these things can be affected by the existence of a youth record. So we try really hard to steal as many of those records as possible. And we've actually done, I think, over 600 youth records. And Katya Dow, who's the director of the program, has actually trained 100 attorneys across Harris County to also do these pro bono sealings. And then finally, when we talk about the origins of issues, we also have a school discipline program. And that's really to target the issue. We have this, school to prison pipeline. And what we're trying to do is get the schools away from sort of that justice system approach and work with the schools on advocacy, compassionate, listening, outreach, wraparound services. And right now we also have a focus on disability advocacy, because oftentimes kids with disabilities might be targeted as behavioral problems, and the schools are negligent in following through with 504 compliance, so making sure that those kids get the accommodations that they, rightfully deserve.
Absolutely. And then you had mentioned before wraparound services. I was wondering if you can expand more about that.
Absolutely. So, kids don't live in a bubble, neither do adults. So when we talk about wraparound services, we talk about access to housing stability, food stability, mental health care, actual health care, any sort of thing. When we're dealing, especially with kids in the dual system, there's a lot of comorbidity that exists with these kids. There might be early childhood trauma, which requires a very specific type of therapeutic modality, right? So our goal is to try to get like the best practices for these kids and advocate on behalf of that, and also make sure that the systems within their living are also given access to those modalities. So we might have a child in like a residential treatment center, but the goal is to have them reunified with the family. Well, we can't just give the kid the wraparound services. We also need to be able to support the family, so the family is ready and has the skills to accept the kid, that the family can work on underlying issues that may have, contributed to issues within the family breakup as well. But we partner with a lot of organizations. So we work with Harris County Youth Collective, which is a super organization that actually has kids. Well, they're adults now. I'm sorry, I can refer to anybody 25 or younger as kids. But people who've been dual system kids, and they become sort of community specialists, and they do outreach to other kids who might be at risk, and they work and collaborate and mentor. We work with Texas Appleseed, which is a tremendous legislative advocacy body, Restoring Justice, which does pro bono legal work for adults with felony charges. So we really just try to create as many resources and like partnerships and collaborations as possible, so we can really work with the unit and the community as a whole.
Definitely. So often from a young age, children are disadvantaged for circumstances beyond their control, and they are set up to be so far behind their peers, which I think definitely is so important that everything that GCAP does, helping a child holistically. And one of the initiatives that you were focusing on was GCAP's decision, which you had mentioned previously, to ensure every dual status youth has a guardian ad litem. And it's definitely one of the things that we agree is so important, because without that special advocate, children can often, like you said, fall into the cracks and become disproportionately more likely to suffer from adverse effects later on in life. But kind of speaking more on that, I was wondering if you can tell us more about some of the most formidable barriers GCAP has faced.
So the first one, pragmatically, which is I think a barrier a lot of people face and a lot of organizations face, is funding. Funding is a really big issue. We're attorneys, so our background isn't in fundraising, right? So like it's sort of a learning curve a little bit at the time, and everybody sort of needs money, right? So all of us are developing these programs and trying to create, de-identified data to show that this program actually could work in some excellent way for the community, and then also not losing focus of the kids themselves, right? So that's a weird balance. And the Law Center has been incredibly supportive of GCAP, but everybody's kind of limited, and especially in this COVID age where we're talking about wraparound services, and then your access to the kids has changed. We don't necessarily see the kids as much because they're online. So when the schools might have seen them first, they're not seeing them at all. And wraparound services are not inexpensive. So while we can collaborate with other organizations, the fact remains that, the more we add to their caseload, the more they add to our caseload, the more manpower we need. So funding has definitely been a continuing hurdle. And like I said, that's definitely not unique to JCAP, but it is a significant one. And then the other issue, which is sort of more specific to JCAP, is our record sealing clinic. So we do record sealing in Harris County all the time, right? We have our templates, we know how to do it. Harris County collaborates with us. It's really easy to do. Texas has 254 counties, which means they have 254 different record sealing protocols. So what we've been doing is trying to create a protocol for every single county in Texas so that we can effectively do this record sealing. And especially with dual system youth, we might have a kid who started in Harris County, was placed in like a residential treatment center through CPS in San Antonio, and maybe they ran away from San Antonio. So then they picked up a runaway offense in San Antonio. So then we have to go to Bexar County and steal a record there. And we have to make sure that we have all the agencies on notice that Bexar County requires. So that actually is just a really time-consuming process, which is like every county does it differently. So we have to make connections with the county, make sure we have the right records, the right agencies, make sure we're doing it on time. Sometimes they want a hearing because they might oppose the record sealing. So that one's actually been an interesting and tricky one to navigate.
Absolutely. I can only imagine how foster kids fit into this because they move from home to home so often that they could virtually be in more than 10 homes in more than 10 counties within a couple years.
Yeah. Foster kids, like I said, they are probably the most vulnerable population. So as I understand it, like the most recent data shows that foster care youth experience PTSD at 2 times the rate of war veterans. So PTSD is a very significant issue because especially kids who have experienced early childhood trauma, and we do work with trauma specialists about this. So if they have an early childhood trauma, a lot of that trauma happens pre-language, which also goes back to this idea of advocating for therapeutic modalities and making sure that we have these connections with the appropriate therapeutic modalities. So we have kids that show up and we'll, as guardian ad litems, or, we're looking at court reports and we see psychological evaluations that throw out some pretty scary and intimidating diagnoses for these kids. And the answer goes back to, that's really looking at the child's behavior at this moment in time. What we're missing is what happened to the child. And are these correct diagnoses? Are we actually going back to the root and the cause of these symptoms? Or are we just sort of throwing out these placebos, like treating cancer with some pain medication as opposed to actually treating the illness? So the foster care youth really need that extra advocacy because so much of their behavior, you're right, is affected by what led them into the foster care system in first, but also, right, the attachments. How can they be bounced around from place to place and, not be able to form attachments? It's incredibly disruptive. It's disruptive to their, to their development, to their education, to everything. And, that is where the guardian ad litems can be very helpful because our goal is to have a guardian ad litem that follows the child the entire time until they merge out of our CPS system, which, can be at 18, or if they choose extended care, it can go a little bit longer, but not the guardian ad litems are only there for that like one, maybe juvenile delinquency hearing, right? That they stay with them for years so that there is somebody reliable and saying, we need to take a step back. This is what we know. These are our goals, and we're going to keep working towards those goals no matter what obstacles come up.
Absolutely. So then on the flip side, what would you say that some of the greatest successes JCAP has had?
Oh gosh. I mean, certainly our record sealing. I think actually, since Harris County is a little bit unique in terms of, we have 3 youth courts, but really having strong partners and attorneys in those youth courts who also want to work with our law students and engage them and really train them on how to be effective youth advocates. JCAP sat on the dual system task force for the Texas Supreme Court to really talk about best practices that could be applied not only in Harris County, where we've had some success, but also statewide. So maybe there's some, legislative intent to really improve this and streamline the system so all of these kids get the best representation, no matter what county they're sitting in. And again, I think our collaborations are pretty amazing. It's sometimes there are egos involved, no matter where you are, and certainly with attorneys, right? Like, I know how to do this, but the fact is all of us are actually there for the same reason, which is to make this better, to advocate for these kids, to put kids first, and building those, bridges and collaborations has been an enormous success for JCAP.
Absolutely. And then I don't want to take up too much of your time, but then I just had one last final question for you.
Of course.
So I was wondering, for our viewers, what is something that you wish that everyone knew about the juvenile justice system?
Okay, so there's a couple of things, if you allow me. So the first one is, I think most people don't know that the juvenile justice system is what we call quasi-criminal. So it means that it's civil and criminal at the same time. It actually sits in civil court, which means a lot of protections that adult criminal defendants receive because of our Constitution, they aren't automatically afforded to kids. So there's been a lot of work over the last 50 years to really make sure that kids get the same protections that an adult criminal defendant would get, like the right to an attorney, the right to remain silent. These are things that actually had to be fought for in the Supreme Court. So I think that that's something that most people don't understand, that kids actually don't sit in a criminal system. And so there's a little bit more leeway in terms of how we have to protect them. We just have to be extra cautious because they aren't given those defenses. And then the other one is about the youth records. It is so important that youth records aren't automatically sealed. We've closed records for people who are 50 years old, that they had my most recent one, I had somebody who stole something that was worth less than $20 when they were 14 in the 80s. And it still showed up on an application. And she's 50 years old now. And it's ridiculous, but most people don't know that these things aren't automatically sealed. And so it's really important to pay attention to the entire step of the justice process, from the moment that child is detained until the moment that record is sealed. That could be, 5 years, it could be 10 years, but you have to stay with it. We have to be diligent about these things because otherwise the kids end up being punished twice.
So then previously you had mentioned that whether it was housing, whether it was applying for the Common App, there are just so many ways that if a child did commit a felony or committed a misdemeanor, it would show up later on those applications.
Yeah.
If the records aren't sealed and a child, not a child, but an adult, like you said, at age 50, would the employer or the person who the application was going to be able to see what offense it was specifically? Or would it just be
That's a great question. So they would be able to see that there was an offense. They can see generally if it's like a felony or a misdemeanor. And that's the other sort of tricky part of the record sealing is that there are some agencies that can see everything, even when it is sealed. So we always encourage our clients to get a copy of their record. So the military can see everything. So they can see that there was a record, but they can't see what it was. So we always try to get a copy of the record so that you can demonstrate this is exactly what happened. This was the offense. This was my disposition or my sentencing. So disposition is what happens to kids. This is when I was released from it. And here are the orders to seal it so that you can have full transparency. Otherwise, state level agencies, employment agencies, et cetera, once it's sealed, it should just be gone. And in that case, if you were applying, let's say for college on the Common App, if your record was officially sealed, you could say, no, I was never adjudicated at this offense. So it's really critical. And then again, for certain federal benefits like Section 8 housing, your family could actually be kicked out of Section 8 housing based on records that you might have had. And we just find that just contributes to basically this cycle of need. And I don't know. I mean, personally, it's just appalling. So it's just a work that continues to need to be done. And if there's no solution right now for sort of fixing the way the statutes are, then we just have to keep advocating.
Absolutely. And I definitely agree that everything that GCAP has done has been not only a great start, but has made such incredible progress in making sure that children are truly able to be set up for success.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us today.
Thank you so much, Abigail. This has been a real pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was an honor to meet you, Gabriella.